and various varieties of Buddhism and Sikhism and all these other things that are going on around these various third world primitive cults and so forth that exist in Africa and that existed in parts of indigenous America, etc. Durkheim's answer was all religions are ultimately about the distinction of the sacred and the profane. Sacred things, sacred ideas, sacred symbols, and profane things and ideas and symbols. Now, the concept, the idea of sacredness is certainly not something that's alien to religious believers. They all know, every member of every religious group knows what their sacred texts are. They know what their sacred ideas and who their sacred people and historical stories and so forth are. Durkheim doesn't define it, though, in the way that those folks often talk about that. For them, the religious believers, the sacred has something to do with the supernatural. It's something to do with some power that's beyond the natural material world and that has some significant power and influence over us in the material universe. Durkheim's argument is that ultimately, as a sociologist, he says we can't be interested in that. We can't pay any credence to that notion of the supernatural. We know as good materialists, in fact, that we don't have sufficient evidence to count that in our accounts of what religion is. Nonetheless, as sociologists and even skeptical agnostic sociologists, we know that religion has been pretty important in American culture for a long time. So let's try to inquire into why it's been so important. Durkheim says, okay, so we have these terms sacred and profane. The sacred is basically just ideas or objects or symbols that inspire awe and respect of some very serious variety. And indeed, in many religions, and in some of the sort of quasi-religions in popular culture that we'll talk a little bit, hopefully a little later on, that sacredness is taken so seriously that people will kill you if you profane their sacred objects. That is, if you touch a sacred object that you're not in a specifically prepared ritual state to be allowed to touch. If you go up and profane the host at a Catholic Mass, expect trouble. Right?
So that's a kind of actually kind of totemism, isn't it?
Totem, well, incredibly, you must have read Durkheim, because totemism is precisely the religious form that Durkheim says is the most primitive religious form. That's where he wants to start his inquiry, and it's in totemism that he says we have to look at how sacred and profane works in order to understand not only how it works there in totemism, but also to understand how it works in every other kind of religion, including all the contemporary forms of religion.
And when he talks about totemism, of course, he means something beyond simply a wooden log with an eagle on top of it.
Right. Well, that's the sign of the totem that we all know from Westerns, right?
That's the classic example of
the
it.
Totem pole.
A totem
with
pole.
Images of animals and the spirit of the sky or what have you. Totemism is basically a very primitive form of religion, which Durkheim studied in its incarnations in indigenous America and in Aboriginal Australia. Very primitive form of religion, which is about basically groups of people who identify themselves with particular totemic individuals or symbols or elements. Often they are animals. So a particular group, there's one group, for example, this always gets a laugh from my class when we talk about this. One group that Durkheim talks about an Aboriginal group that he talks about in the elementary forms, which is their totem is the witchetty grub. The grub as a little worm. And I always sort of talk to them in this, I present it as going, if I were going to be a totemist, I think I'd probably pick a little more impressive totem animal than a grub.
On the other hand,
worm, a tiger or an eagle or something.
Well, right? How many witchetty grubs have condemned non-believers to hell? So
the witchetty grub has its advantage.
So they're
right. But the grub, literally, in this totemic group, the grub itself, that is the actual animal. And the symbolic representations of that animal, that is, all of them, they mark their bodies in certain ways so that they bear the sign of the grub. They literally see themselves as in a kind of family relationship with the grub and with the symbols of the grub.
And sometimes a transformation, a ritual transformation.
In particular ritual engagements with the grub, they ingest it as part. They have to be in a very specific, sacred, ritualized space in order to do that without invoking certain evil, nasty consequences.
There are tribes in Africa that identify with crocodiles, for instance, and they mark their skin in the same way.
They mark themselves. When they do that, they're literally saying, we are members of the same family. We come from the same common ancestor. And in a sense that, obviously, those of us who read some science and know a little bit about evolution and so forth, we know. Well, in evolutionary terms, we may make the same argument, but it's not quite that position that the Wichity Grove.
No, that's no.
In any event, Durkheim says, let's look at these totemic groups. What do? Well, what they do is first of all, they have totemic symbols, entities with which they identify themselves very powerfully, and then to go back to our favorite, or to come to our favorite phrase from Durkheim. They get together collectively and engage in ritualistic interaction in order to produce something that Durkheim called collective effervescence. Effervescence just in the sense that a soft drink is effervescent, bubbly, energy. And Durkheim says this is really the core of what religion does. In other words, from a sociological, philosophical standpoint, forget about the supernatural stuff. He says, put that stuff aside. Yeah, that's what they believe is going on. The Wichity Grove clan thinks all this stuff is going on. The Catholic who takes the host thinks that it's Christ's body. So Durkheim says, sociologists, we can't have any truck with that stuff. That's not our affair.
But you can describe the phenomenon.
Well, we can describe the phenomenon in sociological terms. What is actually happening there? When the Wichity Grove clan gets together, they dance around, they get all sweaty, they get energetic, they imbibe, they eat the ground up grub.
It's the socialization.
It's the production of social solidarity.
It's tent revival.
That's right. Exactly
interesting,
right.
but that's human. There's
that's human.
Nothing.
Exactly.
It always comes down to atheism. That's what atheists do. There's nothing supernatural. You don't need the supernatural. And we like the human more than we like the supernatural because take away that effervescence and people aren't all that interested.
Right.
It's like a rock concert. Same.
That's exactly it.
Tent revivals,
That's right. And so now there's the segue from Durkheim, the historical figure writing this book 100 years ago in France, to I think what's interesting about Durkheim's thesis and about the sacred and the profane now is that we start to see, I think...
Oh, can I interrupt you?
Sure.
We described sacred. Could you please... did we
profane,
do
that's
profane?
Right. We didn't do the profane.
Right.
And maybe subconsciously I was trying to avoid it because it's for Durkheim it's the term really that he has some difficulty defining it, and ultimately only really defines it as anything in a particular social group, organization that is not sacred.
Oh, okay.
So it's basically just the quotidian, mundane, the stuff basically you can interact with in any old way you want to, and there's no danger. In the Wichity Grove clan, there are all sorts of objects in the everyday world, your hut or whatever abode you live in, your clothing, other stuff, that you can interact with. You can throw them down on the ground, you can treat them whatever way you want, and there are no possible ritual penalties or other things that you incur. You don't have to have any particular rules by which you approach it. Sacred things or otherwise.
Okay. Right.
Sacred things they have to be approached with specific rules and in specific states, or else you get into trouble.
But I think we should also emphasize that there's a difference between Durkheim's characterization of the sacred and the profane, as opposed to what would be, say, the conventional, the way we would use it conventionally, good and evil.
Good and evil. No. It's more complicated than that for Durkheim. Because in fact, he says the good and evil distinction is a good one to fit in here, because Durkheim actually argues in this book, and it's a point that I expand on a lot in the book that I've just written, and that I'll talk about in the other forthcoming book as well. He says sacredness is in fact, it can't be equated with simply goodness, moral goodness.
Right.
Because he says there are sacred entities which represent both good and evil.
Yes.
Right? In other words, for Christians, Satan is a sacred entity.
Sure.
Why? He inspires awe. He inspires respect, terror, even. In other words, Durkheim says their sacredness comes in two different varieties. What he calls the pure sacred and the impure sacred. The pure sacred is, to make the definitional matter as easy as possible, to adhere to stick to Christianity, because it's the thing that most folks will know something about. In Christianity, the pure sacred is clearly, the representative for Catholics, the representations of the Virgin Mary, or the representations of the Christ, the crucifix, etc. There's also impure sacred stuff, though, and that is the devil and his various incarnate demons. All those sorts of supernatural beings. The inverted crucifix, right?
It's very complicated, because you could use the impure sacred to profane the pure sacred.
Sure, absolutely.
You could eat a ham sandwich at your